How will these policies, which you think don't make sense and are actually going to hurt the economy, when will consumers start to really feel the impact?
I think that this really is imminent, and that's going to mean that prices are higher. It's going to mean that economic growth is slower. It's going to mean that unemployment goes up. It's going to mean that some shelves are empty.
Your level of confidence in what you just said is what? What percent?
North of 90%.
All right, so explain this to me. The president is saying that in 2016 that we had no inflation, yet we had hundreds of billions of dollars of tariffs that he put on China, and yet we had no inflation, we had no big cost differential. Explain to me, is that accurate? Is that a fair assessment, and does it apply today?
No, I don't think it's accurate. He's correct that overall inflation was not a problem. The type of inflation that we lived with in 2021 and 2022 was not an issue. Didn't happen as a consequence of his tariff increases during his first term. But if you look at the goods to which tariffs were applied, so President Trump in 2018, wanted to put tariffs on certain goods, heavily focused on imports from China. If you look at the goods to which tariffs were applied, the prices of those goods went up. And the difference between 2025 and 2018 is that President Trump wants to apply tariffs to every good we import. And so the scope and aggressiveness of the trade war we're currently in is just much greater than the scope and aggressiveness of the trade war during his first term. But the basic economic question, if you put a tariff on an import, does that make the import more expensive to consumers? The right answer to that question is yes. And we saw that during President Trump's first term. And I predict that we will see it again this year.
Well, but let me ask you, he's saying that he's going to, quote unquote, encourage/force companies like Walmart, some drug companies, et cetera, to eat the differential in terms of lowering profits. Does that make sense? Could he do that?
Well, I think the right way to think about this is that, who bears the economic burden of the tariff, right? And, that has to do with complicated factors about the responsiveness of consumers and of suppliers to increases in the tariff rate. There are certainly some goods where the consumer is going to bear a smaller share of the tariff burden. Consider the flip side for a minute. If the government puts a big tax on cigarettes, so, you say you live in Virginia like I do, the state of Virginia puts a big tax on cigarettes. The person who's actually handing over the money to the government is the store where you buy the cigarettes. But who's actually paying the price of that tax? Who's bearing the economic burden of that tax? Well, it's consumers, because consumers who buy cigarettes are typically not sensitive to increases in the price. People who sell cigarettes know that, and they're able to raise the price of the cigarettes in order to pass along the burden of the tariff. So, some goods to which tariffs are going to be applied are like cigarettes, where people in America really need the good that's being imported, and the people they're buying that good from, the companies they're buying that good from, know that, and they're able to pass along the burden of the tariff. Other goods are going to be closer to President Trump's hope, where either the foreign seller is going to bear a lot of the burden of the tariff, or the domestic is going to bear a lot of the burden of the tariff. But again, the kind of key point here is that consumer prices are going to go up, and the prices facing businesses who import parts and supplies are going to go up. They may not go up in every instance. They may not go up the full amount of the tariff, but they're going to go up.
Talking to Michael Strain, Director of Economic Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. Just to be clear, based on what we just heard from President Trump, saying that when he put tariffs on China back in 2018 and prices didn't go up, his words were, we had no big cost differential. You're just saying that that's just not true.
Yeah, that's just not true.
Right. The prices actually did go up on the specific items that he was putting tariffs on, which were what?
Imports from China, certain other select goods like steel and aluminum and a few things like that. But again, this time around, he wants to put a tariff on every import.
Right. All right, let me play it. Go ahead.
And so you're just going to see more price increases.
All right, I want to play another piece of sound from President Trump. This is him sort of talking about it from a quasi-political perspective. This is number 4.
Why impose tariffs that you know are hurting American businesses?
They're not hurting. They're helping because they're creating jobs in America. We're creating tremendous amounts of jobs in America like you've never seen. We're having investment in America. We're not getting ripped off by every country in the world. We've been ripped off by every country in the world. They're making their product. They sell it. They don't give our people the jobs. They make them with other countries' jobs. And we will have something that nobody will ever see again, I think. I think we have a potential to do numbers that we never envisioned in the wildest year. Look at what's happening. 10 to 12 trillion dollars in literally a couple of months. It's nothing like that's ever happened. It's we're doing a very special thing.
Michael Strain, is that number just made up?
Yeah. I think so. Look, I mean, there are a couple different things we could talk about there. Will the trade war increase manufacturing employment? Are we being ripped off?
Yeah, well, let's take them one by one. First, on this number of 10 to 12 million, 10 to 12 trillion, that's just fantasy, right?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So now let's talk about whether it's going to be creating jobs in America. I mean, look, I get the goal, right? But it just, and again, I'm not an economist, but this idea of bringing back a lot of the manufacturing jobs, right, to the United States. Yeah, I guess if you pay people here enough, you could bring back manufacturing jobs. But I would think that to do that would significantly increase the price of the goods.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, so to think about whether or not tariffs are going to bring back manufacturing jobs, we have to go a little deeper into what tariffs actually will do. I think there are 3 important effects of tariffs to consider here. One is that tariffs will provide some protection for domestic manufacturers against competition from imported goods. And this is what gets all the attention. So, I can buy a widget that was made in Kentucky, or I can buy a widget that was made in China. If you put a tariff on the Chinese widget, now the Chinese widget is a little bit more expensive. That makes me more likely to buy the widget produced in Kentucky. And that means that the widget factory in Kentucky is more competitive. Demand for their widgets goes up. That means they want to hire more workers, and you see an increase in manufacturing employment. That is a real thing that happens. So let's give the president his due. That effect of higher tariffs is a real effect, and there's good evidence for it in the data. But there are 2 other important effects, and we always talk about tariffs with reference to consumer goods, right? We're importing stuff from abroad that households and consumers are purchasing, but actually most of our imports are supplies that businesses need to make things here. They are parts, they are components, they are those sorts of inputs into production, and they're being purchased by businesses, not by consumers. And so if you put a tariff on imports, you're making the things that businesses need to buy in order to produce here at home more expensive.
Mm.
And since most of our imports are supplies and parts that businesses need, that's actually the primary effect of these tariffs. So by raising the cost of production to manufacturers, you make them less competitive. You make it harder for them to expand. That puts downward pressure on employment. Think about, for example, the steel industry. If we put a tariff on steel imports, which President Trump has done, that's going to help some US steel manufacturers, but it's going to hurt businesses that use steel to make stuff here. For every one job in America producing steel, there are 80 jobs, 80 jobs in industries that use steel. So you're helping that one steel maker, but you're hurting the 80 guys who are in the steel using industries. Then the third effect is that other nations don't just sit around and accept US tariff increases. They retaliate. And that hurts US exporters. And we saw this in President Trump's first term. There were a bunch of tariffs on US agricultural exports. The tariffs against US agricultural exporters were so severe that President Trump had to bail out the agriculture sector. And so, you've got protection from competition with imports that should boost employment. Higher costs of production should reduce employment. Retaliation should reduce employment. It turns out that when you net all three of those effects, you see employment losses. So President Trump's first trade war, the 2018 to 2019 trade war, led to fewer manufacturing jobs, not more. And the same thing's going to happen with the current trade war.
That's one of the best explanations that I've heard of this issue from Michael Strain from the American Enterprise Institute, because it is what I like to always encourage on the show, which is nuance. It's not just it's all bad. No, he's making the point that, yes, there can be some positive impacts, but when you do a cost-benefit analysis and you assess that the net effect is a negative. There was another issue, right, that you alluded to, and that's something else that President Trump said in his statement, which is we've been getting ripped off by every country in the world. We've been getting ripped off. They're making their products, et cetera, et cetera. But this was the big lie at the outset of this, was the idea that, these are reciprocal tariffs. That's all we're going to do is reciprocal tariffs, because I think a lot of people would have been supportive of the idea of quote unquote reciprocal tariffs, but that's not what this was. So A, tackle that, and B, tackle the issue of him telling the public that we've been getting ripped off by every country.
Yeah, so I think the key to understanding what the president means when he says things like this is that the president is very focused on bilateral trade deficits. So, what does that mean? The trade deficit between the United States and another country. So U.S. businesses export a bunch of goods to the United Kingdom. U.S. Consumers and businesses import a bunch of goods from the United Kingdom. If we export more than we import, we're running a bilateral trade surplus. If we import more than we export, we're running a bilateral trade deficit. The president is very concerned about those bilateral deficits. And he thinks that if we are importing less from a country than we are exporting to that country, that we are losing. That we're losing.
Right, but that's not a reciprocal tariffs issue. That's it. That's who's consuming what from each country, right?
So the idea behind the reciprocal tariffs is that they are a customized tariff rate for each individual country designed to correct those bilateral trade deficits. And so in theory, if you're a country with whom we run a trade surplus, then the reciprocal tariff rate should be 0. And if not, if we run a bilateral deficit, then there should be a higher reciprocal tariff rate in order to correct that imbalance. Now, I think the most important thing to say about this from an economic perspective is that there is no reason in the world to be concerned about bilateral trade deficits. I run an enormous bilateral trade deficit with Amazon. I buy lots and lots of goods from Amazon. I never have sold a single good to Amazon. And I'm better off for that, and Amazon is better off for that. The United States runs an enormous bilateral trade deficit with Madagascar. Madagascar exports vanilla beans, which Americans like. We like vanilla, and Madagascar is a low-income country, and they're not interested in purchasing the things that we export. And so we run a big bilateral trade deficit with Madagascar. That's fine. It's making Americans better off. It's making businesses and households in Madagascar better off. And so the president is just fundamentally mistaken in this view that bilateral trade deficits matter. There, but to give him some credit, there is an intuition here. If you think about the conflict with Canada, the president has said, we import all this lumber from Canada. Why do we do that? We have forests here. Why are we importing cars from Canada? We can make cars here. And there's an intuition there. And that's the way that most world leaders thought about global commerce for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. It just turns out that that's the wrong way to think about it. And
Why?
Because by allowing for specialization, by allowing the people in Madagascar to produce the vanilla beans and no Americans to produce the vanilla beans, in my case, by allowing Amazon to produce all the goods that I need, and me not to produce any, I'm able to focus on things that I'm better at. Amazon's able to focus on things that it's better at. And that means that we're more productive, and that means that our wages are higher and our incomes and standards of living are.
But you've now made a persuasive case about why trade deficits shouldn't matter, right? And we're talking to Michael Strain, Director of Economic Policy at the American Enterprise Institute, which is a right-leaning, well-regarded organization. And he's making another point, though, which is that when it comes to tariffs, right, they've been ripping us off. So put aside for a moment the deficit issue, which I think is entirely clear. It makes no sense to start punishing countries because they buy more of our stuff than we buy from them, right? That seems pretty easy to understand. But what about his argument that when it comes to tariffs, and this would be the question about quote unquote reciprocal tariffs, that was not the way that the tariffs were rolled out, is there an argument that we've been getting ripped off to some degree on that issue?
Yeah, so I think they're related, because the only way to make sense of what the president is saying and doing is if you assume incorrectly, but still if you assume that a bilateral trade deficit is evidence that we're being ripped off. And that's
right,
the
but let's put that
assumption
aside. But because I hear you, and you're right that that's the argument he's making. But I'm now trying to sanitize his argument, right? Make it a little more effective and challenge you a little more on it and say, all right, so let's put aside the deficits. Let's say that he stops talking about this as if the two are one. And let's just talk about the issue of tariffs. Is it fair to say that we have generally been getting ripped off on the issue strictly of tariffs?
No, it's not. It's not fair to say at all. The U.S. Applied, roughly a 2% tariff on imported goods from the European Union. The European Union applied roughly a 2% tariff on the goods that EU businesses and households import from the United States. And this is reciprocal. This is roughly the same tariff rates. If you look at our put China aside, because I think the president is on much stronger ground with China, not so much with respect to tariffs, but just with respect to general trade and commercial practices. So put China aside. If you look at the nations that we've targeted here, Canada, Mexico, Japan, the EU, the UK, these are nations that had very low tariff rates on U.S. imports. They're nations to which the U.S. applied until a couple months ago, nations to which the U.S. applied a very low tariff rate. And so there is no situation where some country is charging us a 20% tariff and we're charging them a 2% tariff, at least among our major trading partners, and where there's some huge need to correct the situation. It's a separate question, and we probably don't have time to go into it, about whether it would make sense even in that case. So if Canada were charging a 20% tariff, should we raise our tariff rate to match that? I don't think we should, but that's a separate question. Right. I do think China is its own thing, and China is a bad actor in global commerce. China breaks all sorts of rules. They steal all sorts of business practices and information. And so maybe we want to do something aggressive on China, but the EU, Canada, Japan, the UK, this just doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
All right, Michael Strain, last question before we go to calls. How will these policies, which you think don't make sense and are actually going to hurt the economy, when will consumers start to really feel the impact of that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'll tell you, this is something that I've been wrong about. So I expected to see some evidence that consumer prices were going to go up last month in response to these tariffs, and maybe some evidence that the labor market was starting to soften, and we haven't seen that yet. But I think that this really is imminent. I think we're going to see prices in the current month, the month of May, go up as a consequence of these tariffs. Certainly in the month of June, I suspect we're going to see this have tangible effects on the labor market. So right now there are a bunch of cargo ships steaming across the ocean into American ports, and those cargo ships are not full. And that means that some consumers are going to have a hard time finding items. The prices of those items are going to go up. It also means we're going to see some layoffs for truck drivers and transportation workers. It means we're going to see some layoffs for in the warehouse sector, and that's gonna ripple through.
And that's the kind of thing you can't just immediately fix, right? I was talking earlier in the show about this idea that he threatens tariffs and then he pulls back and the market goes up and down, but the stuff you're talking about takes a while to fix that stuff, right? Because businesses have to plan ahead.
Yeah, it takes a while to fix that stuff for sure. That's absolutely right. It's also the case that, yes, the president lowered the tariff rate on Chinese imports by 115 percentage points, but it's still really high. And if you look at the kind of average tariff rate, the average tariff on a typical imported good, tariff rates are higher today than they have been at any time since the Smoot-Hawley tariff era of the 1930s. And that includes the 115 percentage point reduction on Chinese goods. So even given that big de-escalation, tariff rates are still over 6 times as high as they were when President Trump took office in January. And they're higher than they've been since the 1930s. And that's going to mean that prices are higher. It's going to mean that economic growth is slower. It's going to mean that unemployment goes up. It's going to mean that some shelves are empty. And it's gonna cause some real economic problems for consumers and businesses.
And you have no doubt about that. Meaning, you were saying you were wrong about the timing. Mm-hmm. Your level of confidence in what you just said is what? What percent?
My level of confidence in what I just said, by the end of the year, is north of 90%.
Got it.